Hello, welcome to lesson -1 of my music theory classical music composition course. So basically, this lesson is -1 because the lesson is about instruments, just like violins, flutes, that kind of stuff. And like I don't know, I feel like people who want to go into musical composition or just want to study music theory in general kind of already have like a basic understanding of like what instruments actually exist. So, this first unit, which I titled Unit 0, and also these first few lessons, which I titled Lesson -1 and Lesson 0, they're kind of optional. Like, you don't need them, but like, if you're completely clueless about music at all, like, you don't even know what the instruments are, then this is, like, just take these as like a background. But yeah, these lessons are optional. Most people probably won't need them, but yeah, they're just like setting the background, like the groundwork. So basically, in the symphony orchestra, there are four different instrument groups. So they're the strings, the woodwinds, the brass, and the percussion. So the strings are the instruments that play with strings. They use a bow with horsehair on it, and they use strings made out of either metal or intestine. The woodwinds are instruments that make sound by blowing air through a narrow, like a sharp end, a reed. And then brass are instruments made out of metal that you play by blowing air through them. And then lastly, percussion. Well, there's like percussion instruments like drums. You hit them. They're a very wide variety. So basically, I'll start with the strings. So the strings have mainly six instruments. So you have the violin, the viola, the cello, the bass, and the harp and the piano. So technically, the piano is kind of like in the middle ground. It's not really a string instrument, but I'll include it here for now. So basically, the violin is the main star of the orchestra. It's usually the one that gets the melody the most. It has like the largest amount of players because there's the first violin section and the second violin section, and they're closest to the audience. And so the violins, it's the smallest one out of the string instruments. It's the highest one as well. Yeah. And then the viola. So basically, the viola is not just a mix between the violin and the cello, and it's not just a bigger violin. The viola has a mellower sound. It has a lower string register, and it's a lot bigger than the violin as well. And then the cello is also really important. It has the widest range out of all of the instruments. Um, it has a very nice mellow sound. Fun fact: the reason the cello is a very popular instrument is because the cello perfectly is in the exact like sweet spot range that's very similar to the human voice. And then you have the bass. So the bass actually goes by the name either the contrabass or the double bass. Either one is fine. Probably the reason is because bass often gets confused with either the fish or like the guitar instrument. But yeah, either way, they're both basically the same instrument, like contrabass and then double bass bass. And then you have the harp. So oh yeah, I forgot to talk about the bass. Yeah, the bass is the lowest of the string instruments, like the actual string instruments, because these four are the actual string instruments. And then it's the lowest one. It plays really low. Oftentimes, um, they're so low that like you can only be heard as vibrations if you have hearing loss. Anyway, and then you have the harp. So the harp is basically just like a piano, but like on like strings. Like you pluck them, and then for piano, we all know the piano. It's like a keyboard. So basically, the bass has some variations to it. So basically, there's also like the octo bass, which is like a really big bass that's like 20 feet tall with three strings. But I didn't include that because that's not really, you don't really see that in symphonic orchestras. It's like in like two pieces in the entire like world. And then as for harp and piano, so basically piano I considered it a string instrument because it has strings inside of it, and that's what's actually making the sound, like the tapping of those strings in the instrument. So also it's not really like any other instrument. You'll see later that people consider it as a percussion instrument. I really don't think it's a percussion instrument. And then for harp, harps are usually really ornamental. They're not in all symphonies, but yeah. Also, there's a really old variant of the piano called the harpsichord. It's basically just a piano, but like it sounds like a harp inside the piano. Um, but yeah, I didn't include it here because those are really old. They haven't been in an orchestra for like 200 years or something. So, but it's just some musical history. Okay, the next section is the woodwinds. So the woodwinds are instruments that make sound by blowing air through a sharp end, and so the reed. And so basically, these instruments have reeds. They're called woodwinds because they used to be made out of wood, and so you can see them here. And so basically, you'll see there's a wide variety of woodwinds, but you'll find that most of them are like very similar. So first off, you have the flute. So basically, the flute is like the main. Everyone knows the flute, and then you have the piccolo. So the piccolo is just a flute, but higher in octave. So the piccolo has a really sharp and piercing sound, and it's also a lot shorter than the flute. And so basically, you could basically turn the flute into a piccolo by just removing like the other half of like the flute. Like if you'll know what I mean. Like you can just like a flutes are like they take apartable, and you can just remove like one part of it, and it becomes a piccolo. And so all flute players are able to play the piccolo. And I will say that flutes and piccolos don't have reeds. I mean, they kind of do, but like it's not like an actual reed like the oboe has. Speaking of the oboe, so the oboe is like like you can say like queen of the orchestra. They play like F for all the instruments to tune on, and yeah, and the oboe is like it's also actually I'll talk about this later, but yeah. And then there's the English horn. So the English horn is basically an oboe, but like it looks a little bit different. It's a variant of the oboe because the English horn has a lower sound, just like it has the oboe has this comfortable range. The English horn also has a comfortable range, but it's like slightly a few notes lower than the oboe does, and so that like some composers use the oboe for like no use the English horn for like a more warmer sound, like Dvorak does in the second movement of his Ninth Symphony. And then you have the clarinet. So the clarinet's also a major woodwind. Um, yeah, it's a clarinet. And then you have the bass clarinet. So the bass clarinet is just a regular clarinet, but an octave lower. For some reason, bass clarinets read in treble clef instead of bass clef, even though they're basically just a bassoon. And then speaking of bassoon, you have the bassoon. So the bassoon's like the cello of the woodwinds. It's made out of wood. It's really big. It has like the mellow sound that sounds like the human voice. And then you have the contrabassoon, which is just a bassoon but an octave lower. Same thing as the bass clarinet. It's really low, except they does not read in treble clef. It reads in bass clef. And then you have the saxophone, which is technically made out of metal, so it should be a brass, but it's more of a woodwind because it has a reed. And so yeah, and then you have the recorder, which is basically like a clarinet but like smaller. So okay, I'll say some notes. Okay, so basically, for one thing, the bass clarinet and the bass clarinet mainly is like the bass clarinet and the saxophone are more contemporary conventions. So you really don't see saxophone anywhere in symphonic orchestra, so you don't need to worry about like knowing the saxophone. I've literally never like heard a saxophone in an orchestra, and I've never written for saxophone for orchestra. And so, because saxophone's really it's like mainly for jazz, and also some Shostakovich pieces, because Shostakovich is weird. And then as for bass clarinet, yeah, no one writes for bass clarinet. It's also a really contemporary thing, except it's not even in jazz. It's like literally nowhere. Probably marching band. And then English horn and piccolo, they're also pretty rare in the earlier pieces, like the Romantic era. But like you'll see them pretty often. And then as for recorder, I've literally never seen recorder anywhere. I'm pretty sure it's like just like a baby clarinet that like little kids play with. So yeah. Okay, as for saxophone and its variants, so you'll see the same thing in trombones later. But yeah, a lot of these instruments have like different versions of them. There's like alto saxophone, like tenor saxophone, like same thing for trombones, alto trombone, tenor trombone. And so yeah, they're not different instruments, they're just tuned differently. And so yeah, originally when I was making this video idea, I had the idea to like make it include the range of all of these instruments, and also like just like the different versions. Like you can have like horn and F and stuff like that. But since technically if you're here, then you probably also don't know like the note names or anything. So I'll explain that in a later lesson. So yeah. Okay, sorry, I skipped a slide. So the next set is the brass. So the brasses are basically metallic instruments that you make sound by blowing through them. And so there's the horn, the cornet, the trumpet, and the trombone, and the tuba. So basically, the horn is like, or the French horn mainly, is basically just like, is this one? It's like, it's it's my favorite of the brass because it's not really a brass. A lot of people consider it to be a woodwind, even though it's technically not a woodwind. But it's because the hornet has it has the ability to play like a really beautiful soft sound, as compared to the other brass, which are mainly used in orchestras for like big finale sounds. And then you have the cornet. So the cornet is this one. It's basically a trumpet but like stouter because it has like more conic shape, and so basically that allows it to um it affects its sound. And then you have the trumpet. Everyone knows the trumpet. Trumpet's everywhere. And then you have the trombone here. So trombone's like one of the bases of the brass section. Then the tuba, which is like the really low bass of the brass section. So for cornets, a lot of people actually haven't heard of the cornet. That's because cornets is actually a pretty old instrument. Most of the time, the cornet part is usually just replaced by the trumpet part because the trumpet can do the same thing the cornet does. But I feel like you should still know about the cornet because it's actually pretty common in like romantic pieces, mainly for Dvorak stuff, and you'll find it in some Tchaikovsky too if you can. But yeah, the brass section is pretty simple. They're all basically kind of like the same instrument. Yeah. But I will say that like for brasses and woodwinds alike, like they both have like their limitations for like because um they're limited by like the ability of like human lungs. You know what I mean? Also, speaking of woodwinds, I forgot to mention, but there's a specific type of woodwind called the double reed woodwinds. Basically, they have two reeds instead of one reed like the normal ones, and these are the oboe, the English horn, the bass clarinet. No, not bass clarinet. Oboe, English horn, the bassoon, and the contrabassoon. So basically, they have two reeds, and then they make sound by like vibrating the two reeds against each other, and so that makes it a lot harder to play these instruments, and that's why the oboe is often considered the hardest instrument in the orchestra. So yeah. Um, oh yeah, and then trombone, like I said earlier, it has its variants. I just included them on one because they're just the same instrument but tuned differently. Okay, lastly, the percussion. So, uh, you all may know that I do biology lessons as well, but yeah, just like how there's the animal kingdom and then the produce is like where all like the leftovers get put in, the percussion is just like where all like the weird ones get put in. So percussion is like a really wide range of instruments. You can have pitch percussion, you can just like have random percussion. So I just listed like the most common ones I've seen before here, but here is also like a few other ones that I've seen. And then but really anything can be a percussion instrument nowadays. So you have like the main one's the timpani. So the timpani is the one that you see all over symphonies. It's like a drum, both like tones to it, depending on where you like hit the drum to. And so the timpani, so usually in a timpani set, there are only four notes in a timpani set, and mainly you just use it for like low rumbling sounds. You can use it to like add like a booming effect to like your notes, but overall you're not gonna really like it. Is like it adds like a sound, like a bass kind of you could say. But yeah, I really like writing for with timpani. And the triangle, is like it's like a glassy sound. Cymbals, those big like two things like the two metal sheets that slam against each other. Then you have glockenspiels. So glockenspiels and xylophones, they're basically the same thing except glockenspiel is like made out of metal and it has like a really like glassy sound. And then you have drums. So drums, you can have like a snare drum or a bass drum. So snare drums usually in like the later pieces, so contemporary pieces, but bass drums, there you can see them in like late romantic for like adding like a really big effect to like the explosions. And then you have marimbas. Um, it's also basically like a xylophone. But yeah, you can see that there's a wide variety of instruments. I know that like anything can technically be a percussion, like I said. Like I know in Mahler 4, I think, in one of the Mahler symphonies, his percussion instrument was like a person slamming a hammer down onto like a cardboard box or something. And then like it was like really symbolic or something. And then I know for Tchaikovsky's um Overture 1812 that his percussion instrument was a cannon firing cannonballs into the audience. So, I mean, it wasn't like pointing at the audience, but like, yeah. And yeah, those are all the instruments. Familiarize yourself with them. And yeah, okay, see you.